They say the most dangerous man alive is the one who has nothing left to lose. But tonight, on the night his kingdom bled gold and firelight in celebration, King Alpha Draven Kale discovered something far worse than loss. He discovered absence, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that leaves blood on cold stone and a broken pendant where a woman used to breathe. Every empire he built, every enemy he buried, every scar carved into his body meant nothing the moment he turned and she was gone. Stay until the end. You won't sleep tonight either. Hit that like and drop your city below. Let me know where you're watching from, because this story was made for every soul who ever loved something they forgot to protect. He had not smiled in 11 years. That was the fact his generals whispered about in the lower corridors when they believed no one of consequence could hear them. 11 years since the last genuine curve of his mouth, since something living and warm had broken through the granite architecture of his expression. They counted it like a curse, like some dark milestone the kingdom had inherited along with its ruthless king. 11 years of campaigns, of borders redrawn in ash and blood, of rival alphas kneeling on stone floors with their pride shattered and their flags surrendered. 11 years of Draven Kyle being exactly what a king needed to be, which was to say, exactly what a man was never meant to become. Tonight, he almost smiled. The great hall of Vale Thorn Palace roared with celebration. 300 candles burned in iron chandeliers overhead, and the smoke from a dozen different fires, hearth and torch and brazier, thickened the air into something almost heavy enough to taste. The long tables groaned under haunches of roasted game, dark bread, smoked river fish, and enough wine to drown the memories of the men who had not come home from the Eastern Front. The soldiers who had returned drank those memories anyway, loudly, with the reckless gratitude of men who had stood close enough to death to feel its breath on their necks and lived to eat hot food because of it. At the head of the hall, elevated on the carved stone dais where every Kyle king had sat for 4 generations, Draven watched all of it with eyes the color of deep winter, pale gray, almost colorless, cold in the way that glaciers are cold. Not empty, never empty. There was too much happening behind those eyes for emptiness, but controlled. Everything locked behind a face that had been trained since boyhood to reveal nothing that could be used against him. I was 34 years old and built like the hammer his kingdom had forged him to be, broad through the chest and shoulders, in a way that armor only partially concealed, the kind of physical authority that filled doorframes and made men unconsciously step back. A jaw that looked carved rather than grown. Dark hair worn close at the sides and longer on top, threaded now with the first gray at his temples that his war council pretended not to notice. A scar ran from his left eyebrow down across the bridge of his nose, thin and white with age. A blade that had gotten closer than anyone else ever managed twice, the second attempt ending permanently for the man who made it. I was, by every measurable account, the most feared man between the Vale Mountains and the Soltern Sea. His enemies named their nightmares after him. His allies maintained their loyalty through a careful calculation of terror and reward that he had perfected over a decade of rule. He had never, in the memory of any living person who had served the crown, asked for anything twice. And yet tonight he kept looking toward the side passage at the edge of the great hall where she always entered late, because she was always tending something or someone before she allowed herself to sit. Celine. He did not say her name aloud in public. That was a discipline he'd developed slowly, over months of noticing what happened to people when the king's attention became visible. The way other wolves circled what the alpha favored, testing, probing for weakness. He had given his enemies enough weapons already. He would not hand them this one. But his eyes moved to that passage again, for the 3rd time in 20 minutes, and his general of the northern lines, a scarred veteran named Korath, who had ridden beside Draven through 6 campaigns and knew better than most how to read what the king refused to speak, cleared his throat very deliberately and said nothing. Draven looked at him. "She'll be here," Korath said, keeping his voice below the noise of the celebration. "The Fenrath boy took a crossbow bolt through the shoulder during the last river crossing. She won't leave him until the fever breaks." "I know where she is." "Of course you do." Draven picked up his cup, didn't drink from it. "You have a point you're circling toward." "I don't have points," Korath said. "I have observations. You've looked at that passage 4 times since 3, 4. The first time was before you sat down." Korath tilted his own cup and drank slowly. I've ridden into burning cities with you, my king. I know what your face looks like when something matters. Draven set the cup down. Across the hall, two junior officers were attempting to arm wrestle on one of the long tables, while their table companions made noise about it. The sound of the kingdom's relief, that ugly, beautiful noise that soldiers made when the dying was done and the eating could begin, pressed against the stone walls and filled the space between every conversation. She's a healer, Draven said, flatly, as if stating a territorial boundary. She's been your healer for 2 years, Korath replied. Nobody looks at their healer the way Korath. The general stopped. He had served long enough to know where the line lived. Draven was quiet for a moment. Down at the tables, someone started a rough marching song, and a dozen voices picked it up without harmony or any particular regard for the original melody. The sound was enormous and joyful, and somehow lonely in the way that all victory sounds eventually become when you've sat at enough of them. She found the camp fever outbreak before my best medic did, Draven said quietly, after a moment. Not explaining, not justifying, just stating something true into the noise of the room. 3 days earlier, saved 42 men who would have been in the ground before the Eastern campaign ended. She's good at what she does. She's the best I've ever seen. A pause, the length of one controlled breath. She does it like it costs her something, every time. Not like it's work, like it matters. Korath was quiet. He had the wisdom of a man who understood when silence was the only useful contribution. Then the side passage moved, and Celine Vera entered the great hall. She was not dressed for celebration. She almost never was. A simple gray wool dress, practical and unadorned, with her dark hair pulled back in a loose knot that had started falling apart sometime in the last several hours. She had a small smear of something, tincture or ash or both, along the inside of her left wrist that she hadn't noticed yet. She walked with the quiet efficiency of someone whose mind was still half in the sick room, eyes moving across the crowded hall. Not with the social calculation of courtiers, but with the habitual assessment of someone checking for who looked pale, who was favoring an old wound, who had been drinking fast enough to cause problems later. She was not beautiful the way the court women were beautiful, constructed and gilded and presented like offerings. She was something else, honest in her features, dark eyes that held things, a mouth that pressed into a careful line when she was deciding whether to speak, which she almost always was. She saw him looking and did not look away. She never looked away. That had been the first thing he noticed about her 2 years ago when she'd been brought before him as a newly appointed palace healer to receive the king's acknowledgement of her position. Every other person in the room had found something fascinating to study in the middle distance. Celine had looked at him directly, with an expression that was neither challenge nor submission, but simply clarity, like she saw him and had made her calculation and was unafraid of the result. He had thought about that look for 3 days before he found a reason to summon her under the premise of asking about the health protocols for the winter garrison rotation. She had known it was a pretense within about 4 minutes and had not mentioned it then or since. Now she crossed the hall toward the dais, nodding once to Korath, who made a sound that was technically a greeting but functioned as a retreat, and took the seat to Draven's left that was technically assigned to his chief advisor, and had been quietly reassigned in practice for approximately 8 months, without anyone finding it productive to say so officially. Fenrath? Draven asked. Fever's down. He'll keep the arm. She reached across and took a piece of dark bread from the platter without ceremony, the way she did everything. Without performance, without requesting permission, as if the decision to feed herself was simply and obviously hers to make. He's going to try to get up in the morning, and I need you to have someone tell him directly that he is not allowed to do that. I'll have Korath sit on him if necessary. That might actually work. She pulled the bread apart. You're not eating. I ate earlier. She looked at him sideways with the expression she used when she knew he was lying about something minor. You had half a cup of something Mira brought, and then you spent 4 hours in the war room arguing about river crossing logistics with men who should have been sleeping. Someone has to argue about it. Someone has to not collapse from exhaustion 3 weeks after returning from a 5-month campaign. She said it without heat, the way she always said difficult things, like they were simply true, and truth didn't require volume to land. There are limits, Draven, even for you. The use of his name, not his title, not his rank, just his name, spoken low and direct in the noise of the hall, landed somewhere in his chest with a weight that no sword had ever managed. He did not answer. He took a piece of the bread. She noticed and chose not to make it a victory. Around them, the celebration continued its roar. The candles burned lower. Outside the thick walls of Valethorn, the returning soldiers' camp sprawled across the eastern approach road, and from somewhere in the distance came the sound of drums, which meant the night was still young for the men who had survived it. Draven ate the bread. Celine drank some wine, slowly, looking out at the hall with those dark eyes that held things. "You should have been there," he said, not loudly. She looked at him. "The last crossing," he said, "but before the Felrath Ridge, we lost 7 men to the current, 3 more to wounds that—" He stopped. The sentence's ending was obvious, and both of them could see it. "Your predecessor would have cost us twice that. My predecessor had a different idea about whose life was worth saving. He served 12 years before I removed him." "I know." She said it without judgment, which was somehow harder to carry than judgment would have been. "You needed someone loyal enough to save the foot soldiers and the officers equally. That's not a complicated requirement. It apparently was for a decade." She was quiet for a moment. Then, almost carefully, "You notice things most people in your position stop noticing." "I notice everything. That's the cost of the position. That's not what I mean." She looked at him with that directness she had never once dropped. "You notice which men are afraid, and you don't punish them for the fear. You notice who's grieving, and you give them the hard work that keeps grief from becoming dissolution. That's not strategy." A brief pause. "That's something else." He looked at her. The hall roared on around them, enormous and irrelevant. "You give me too much credit," he said. "You give yourself none," she replied. It was the closest either of them had come, in 8 months of whatever this was, to saying the actual thing. The hall seemed to contract slightly around the weight of it, or maybe that was only the sensation inside his chest, the tightening he had stopped pretending not to feel somewhere around month 3, and had started simply enduring, like weather. From across the hall, Lord Assessor Meldon Varys, a heavy man of 50 with the kind of political longevity that came from making himself equally useful and indispensable to whoever was king, caught Draven's eye and raised his cup in the performative toast of a man who wanted to be seen being loyal. Draven returned the gesture with the minimum acknowledgement that courtesy required and immediately looked away. Celine had watched the exchange. "You don't trust him." "I don't trust anyone who's survived 4 changes of royal favor without once standing on the wrong side of anything." That could just be intelligence. It could be. Or it could be that he never stands on any side at all. Draven's jaw was set in the way it got when he was working through a problem. Men like Varys don't have loyalty. They have positions, and positions shift with whoever's holding the most weight. She turned the wine cup slowly in her hands. "Is that why you trust Korath?" "Korath told me I was wrong about the Tarvin siege strategy in front of my entire war council when I was 26 years old, and he was a junior commander with nothing but a decade of scars to recommend him." "What did you do?" "I thought about having him reassigned to the northern latrine garrison." A beat. "Then I thought about what he'd said and realized he was right, and we took the city in 4 days instead of 40. Celine's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, something precursor to it. "And that made you trust him." "That made me understand what trust actually requires." His voice was flat and certain, the tone of a man stating something carved through long experience. "It's not agreement. It's not loyalty to your decisions. It's someone willing to cost themselves something to tell you the truth." She was quiet. The curve at the corner of her mouth had settled into something more still. "Celine," she looked at him. "You've been quiet since you sat down," he said. "Quieter than usual. And you were late." "I told you, Fenrath. Fenrath's fever broke before the second hour of celebration. I had someone check." He watched her face, the careful thing behind her eyes, the thing that pressed against the surface of her expression like water behind a dam. "You could have been here an hour ago." She set down the wine cup. Around them, the hall continued its enormous, indifferent celebration. "I needed to think," she said. "About what?" A pause. "Not long. Just long enough to be the shape of a decision being weighed." "I found something," she said. "In the lower archive, when I was cross-referencing the bloodline records for the Fenrath boys' family medical history, there's a lineage notation that—" She stopped. Her hands were still on the table, very deliberately still. I need to show you properly. Not here. Tell me now. Not here, Draven. Her voice was low and controlled, and underneath the control was something that was not quite fear and was not quite urgency, but was the combination of both that people feel when they are carrying information too large for the room they're in. There are too many ears. What I found. She looked at him, and something passed across her face, fleeting and heavy, that he had never seen there before. It changes things. I need to show you the documents first. He studied her for a long moment. Every instinct he'd built over 34 years of reading men, reading the way they breathed before they lied, the way their hands moved before they reached for a weapon, the way their eyes shifted when they were calculating what they could afford to lose. All of it focused on her face. She wasn't lying. She wasn't performing. She was frightened of something in the particular way that intelligent people are frightened when they have looked at the shape of a problem and understood its full size. Tomorrow morning, he said. First light. The map room. She nodded once. Something in her exhaled slightly, though she hadn't moved. First light. He reached across and placed his hand over hers for exactly the duration of one breath. No one at the long tables would have seen it through the crowd and the candlelight and the noise. She looked down at his hand, then up at him, and the thing that passed between them in that fraction of a moment was not strategy and not performance, and not anything that had a word in the language of kings. Then he withdrew his hand and picked up his cup and looked out at the hall, and Celine straightened in her chair and also looked out at the hall, and the celebration went on. 3 tables away, Lord Varys watched them both and said something quietly to the man beside him, whose name was not on any official record of that evening. The storm came at the 9th hour. It came the way the worst things always came to Valethorn, from the north, fast, with no warning from the Sky Scouts, who should have had at least 2 hours to read its approach. One moment the night was cold and clear, stars visible between the peaks of the Vale Mountains, the city's celebration fires burning straight up in still air. Then the wind hit the valley like something had opened a door in the mountains, and the fires bent horizontal, and the first crack of thunder rolled across the stone city with the physical force of an artillery volley. The great hall shutters rattled, candles guttered, and several dozen blew out simultaneously, dropping portions of the hall into abrupt shadow. The soldiers at the long tables barely paused. Men who had survived 6 months in the field were not unsettled by weather. But the servants scrambled to relight torches, and the court nobles made the nervous sounds of people accustomed to having walls between themselves and anything uncontrolled. Draven was on his feet before the second thundercrack, hand already on the hilt of the short blade he wore at his hip, regardless of ceremony, the reflex of a decade of never assuming that the violent thing was atmospheric. Beside him, Celine had stood as well, one hand on the table, head turned toward the tall windows where the shutters were now hammering continuously against their frames. "That's not natural," she said. "No storm comes that fast. Not from the north, not in celebration season." Her jaw was set. "The sky was clear 20 minutes ago." "I know." He was already moving, not running, but the controlled fast walk of a man who had learned that kings running in their own halls communicated panic to everyone watching. He gestured toward the door guards without looking at them. "Double the watch on every gate. I want Korath and the inner council in the war room in 10 minutes. Then, to Celine, almost as an afterthought that wasn't, "Stay inside tonight." She looked at him with the directness she had never once dropped. "I'm going to check on the sick room, the fever patients." "The sick room is inside," he said. "Stay inside the walls." A beat. She nodded. He held her gaze for exactly as long as he held everyone's gaze. Long enough to make the instruction land, short enough to look like it was about the information and not about her specifically. Then he moved toward the war room, and the hall reorganized itself around the sudden purposefulness of a king in motion, and the storm outside continued to build into something that had no right to exist this quickly. The war room conference lasted an hour, and produced nothing except the confirmation that the storm had appeared as if manufactured, that the Sky Scouts had reported clear sky at the 7th hour and could not explain the discrepancy, and that 3 of the outer gatehouse torches had been extinguished by what the Gatewatch initially reported as wind, before revising that account when they noticed that the torches on the windward side were still burning. Draven stood at the war table with the map of Valethorn spread under his hands and felt, without being able to name its source, a pressure behind his sternum that was not the storm. "Something happened," he said. Korath looked up from the secondary map he'd been tracking troop positions on. "The storm." Not the storm. He straightened. Something else. He looked at the door. Where's Celine? The room was briefly very quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when a king asks a question that sounds like it contains the answer he's afraid of. She went to the sick room, said Kalen, his second intelligence officer, a young man with a sharp face and the permanent expression of someone calculating things. I saw her leave the hall about 20 minutes after you did. She was heading toward the healer's wing. 20 minutes. Draven was already moving. My king. Send someone to the healer's wing, he said, not stopping. Now. Have them report directly to me. He took the corridor at the pace of a man who was not running, because running was the admission of something he was not yet willing to admit. Through the gallery passage that connected the war wing to the residential corridors of the palace, past the portraits of 4 generations of Kyle kings and queens, whose expressions had always struck him as fundamentally irrelevant to the problems the living had to solve. The corridor that led to the upper healer's wing opened onto the east gallery, a long stone passage with arched windows that faced the open inner courtyard. The storm was visible through those windows. The sky above the courtyard, a churning black-green that had never appeared in a natural storm in any record he'd read. Rain driving sideways in the lamplight. The courtyard's ornamental trees bending to angles that suggested something more violent than weather. At the end of the east gallery, the passage turned toward the healer's wing, and instead his eyes found the balcony door. It was open, not ajar. Open fully, the way it would only be open if someone had gone through it. The heavy iron handle was turned. The wooden door was pressed back against the stone exterior wall by the wind, held there by the force of the storm, banging with each gust in a slow, irregular rhythm that sounded in the empty passage like something wrong. He stopped. He did not run. He walked the length of the east gallery at the pace of a man who was making himself look at what was there rather than what he was afraid to see. And then he stood in the open frame of the balcony door with the storm coming at him full in the face, and he looked. The balcony extended perhaps 12 feet outward from the palace wall, a broad stone platform that had been built into the east tower as an observation point, overlooking the city below and the river approach beyond the eastern walls. There were 2 stone benches, ornamental ironwork along the railing, a brazier that had long since been extinguished and was now filling rapidly with rainwater. Celine was not there. The balcony was empty. He stood for a moment that had no particular length, a second, or an hour, or some unit of time that did not correspond to anything measured. Looking at the empty stone, the rain sheeting across it in waves, the city lights below dissolving in the downpour. Then he looked down. The stone nearest the railing was darker in 2 places. Not wet from the rain was falling uniformly across the whole surface. These patches were darker in the specific way that stone becomes dark when liquid thicker than water has pooled on it. One near the center of the balcony, roughly the size of a hand, already beginning to thin at its edges as the rain worked at it. One nearer the rail, smaller, a few drops that had not yet been entirely washed. Blood. Not a large amount. Not the kind of amount that announced catastrophic violence. The kind of amount that came from a struggle, from someone being grabbed and fighting it, from a hand gripping stone hard enough to tear skin, or from a blow that split something minor but visible. He crouched next to the larger patch, even though the rain was soaking him instantly, putting his knee on the wet stone without any thought for the fabric, and looked at it with the eyes of a man who had spent enough time at the sites of violence to read what it left behind. The smear pattern moved toward the railing. Whatever happened, the direction had been toward the edge. And then, half under the iron railing post, caught where the ornamental scrollwork curved down to meet the balcony floor. He saw it. A chain. Silver. Broken. Not unclasped, but broken. The link separated by force at a point about 6 inches from the pendant. He knew the pendant before he picked it up. He had seen it at her throat for 2 years. A simple thing, a flat disc of silver with a design on it that she had never explained and he had never asked about because there were things he had understood without words that she was not ready to give him. He had seen it catch the candlelight during the evening and had known, in the private inventory of things he noticed about her that he shared with no one, that it was the only ornamentation she consistently wore. He picked up the pendant with 2 fingers. The chain was broken clean. The disc sat in his palm, still faintly warm from having been worn, and the warmth of it was the most wrong thing on the balcony. Wrong, because it meant she had been here recently, recently enough that the metal still held the heat of her skin, which meant the rain had not yet worked on the blood patches long enough to date them to anything but the last 30 minutes, which meant he stood. He stood with the broken pendant in his fist, and the rain driving into his face, and the storm screaming above the city, and the blood going thin on the stone behind him, and for the first time in 11 years, Draven Kale felt something that was not anger, and was not strategy, and was not the cold management of a problem to be solved. He stood on the empty balcony where she had been and was no longer, where the only evidence she had existed tonight was blood and broken silver and the warmth already leaving the metal in his hand. And the thing that opened in his chest was not pain exactly, because pain had a shape he knew and could navigate. This was the particular terror of something precious and irreplaceable, having been removed from the world without warning, without his permission, without the possibility of negotiation or force, or any of the mechanisms through which he had always managed to prevent what he cared about from being taken. This was the powerlessness he had spent 34 years building a kingdom specifically to never feel. He closed his fist around the pendant until the broken links cut into his palm. From the corridor behind him, running footsteps, Korath, who had apparently followed when Draven left the war room at a pace that communicated something beyond routine, and who arrived now at the balcony door and stopped when he saw what Draven was standing in. A silence between them. The storm. "The healer's wing," Korath said. His voice was careful. "She didn't go there. 2 of the night staff said they didn't see her." Draven turned from his railing. His face was wet. Rain, only rain. And his jaw was the jaw of a man who was holding the entirety of what was happening to him in a grip that would cost something later, much later, when there was time for cost. "Lock down the city," he said. His voice came out level. Completely level. The voice of a king issuing a military directive. "Every gate, every road, every river launch, nothing moves in or out. I want every guard on every wall doubled within the hour. Draven, I want every Alpha commander who attended tonight's celebration in the war room in 20 minutes. He moved past Korath back into the corridor. "I want the harbor watch pulled and reassigned to the eastern road. I want every man who was working this corridor in the last 2 hours in a room where I can look at them." He was walking fast now, down the east gallery, back toward the war wing, and Korath was matching him. "And I want every exit from this palace, every door, every window, every service passage, searched and documented, starting with the east tower and working outward." "I'll have it done," Korath said. He was looking sideways at the king with the face of a man who had ridden into burning cities beside him, and had therefore seen many versions of him, and had never seen this one. "Draven, what happened on that balcony?" Draven stopped walking. He stood in the portrait gallery with the rain audible against the outside walls, and the candles casting their long shadows across the 4 generations of painted Kale kings and the broken pendant still in his closed fist. "Someone took her," he said, "or she was forced over the rail." His voice did not change. His face did not change. But something in the air around him changed, the quality of attention, the specific stillness of a predator who has just identified the direction of the threat and is moving all available resources to respond. Either way, someone in this palace made a decision tonight, and they made it without understanding that there is no fortress thick enough, no alliance large enough, no distance far enough. He started walking again, to protect them from what happens next. Korath said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Ahead of them, the war room doors stood open, light and noise spilling into the corridor, the business of the kingdom waiting to be organized into purpose. Behind them, on the east balcony, the storm continued to wash the stone, and the blood thinned and spread until eventually it was only rain. In his fist, the silver pendant pressed its broken edges into his palm, and the warmth of her finally left it entirely. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, beyond the city, beyond the locked gates, beyond the reach of everything he commanded, Celine Vera disappeared into a night that should have been a celebration, carrying a secret large enough to break a kingdom, and the king who had never once in 11 years felt powerless, walked into his war room to begin the most desperate hunt of his life. But in the archives below, in the lower passage where the bloodline records were kept behind iron doors that required 2 separate keys, the door that Celine had unlocked that evening stood open now, and the lamp inside still burned, and across the reading table spread beneath the light were 3 documents that she had not been allowed to take with her. And in the margins of the oldest one, in Celine's handwriting, in the careful script she used when she was very certain of what she had found and very afraid of what it meant, were 4 words she had written as annotation before the night turned violent. 4 words that, if Draven had read them before the storm, might have changed everything, and if his enemies reached them first, would change everything anyway. The documents were still warm from her lamp. That was the first thing Draven registered when he descended into the lower archive 20 minutes after leaving the balcony. The lamp on the reading table still burned, the oil not yet half consumed, and the heat of it had kept the immediate air around the table several degrees warmer than the stone passage behind him. She had been reading here recently enough that the room still held the shape of her presence, the way a chair holds warmth after someone stands from it. He did not touch anything. Not yet. Korith stood at the archive door with 2 of the inner guard and the good sense to stay outside. Draven stood at the edge of the lamplight and looked at what was spread across the table with the methodical patience of a man who had learned that the first examination of a scene was the only uncontaminated one, and that panic was the thing that made men miss what was actually in front of them. 3 documents. Old. The paper had that particular density of age, yellowed at the edges but not brittle, which put them somewhere in the last century rather than further. 2 were genealogical records, the kind that the palace archive maintained on every significant bloodline within the kingdom's political sphere. Formal, dry, columns of names and dates and succession notations in the tight script of whatever royal recorder had compiled them. The 3rd was different, older than the other 2, written on a different material, thicker, treated, the kind of document that had been made to survive. The script on it was in Old Vaeltic, the predecessor dialect that hadn't been used in formal documents for roughly 80 years, and it bore in its upper right corner a seal that Draven recognized after a moment's delay that felt longer than it was. The Kale lineage seal, his own bloodline. Except the version on this document was the original. The one used before the 3rd consolidation altered the design, which meant this document predated his grandfather's reign. Across the bottom of this 3rd document, in Celine's handwriting, were 4 words. He read them. The archive was very quiet. The storm continued overhead, muffled by the depth of the palace foundations, reduced to a low persistent vibration in the stone that he felt in the soles of his boots rather than heard. He read the 4 words again, not because he hadn't understood them the first time, because the first time he'd read them, he had felt the ground shift under him in the particular way it shifts when something you believed was one shape turns out to be a different shape entirely, and he needed the second reading to confirm that the first had been accurate. He straightened. His jaw was set at an angle that Korath, from the doorway, would have identified as the jaw of a man working very hard not to let what was happening to him be visible. Korath. Here. How many people have access to this archive? A pause while Korath calculated. Officially, yourself, the 3 senior archivists, your chief advisor, and the 2 lineage historians on retainer. Unofficially, a shorter pause, the pause of a man choosing accuracy over comfort. The lock on the east access door hasn't been changed since your father's time. Draven looked at the lock on the east access door. It was the original ironwork, 80 years old at least. Get me the senior archivist, tonight. I don't care what he's doing. He'll be asleep. Then he'll be awake soon. Korath's footsteps retreated. Draven looked back at the documents and at Celine's 4 words and at the genealogical records spread beside the older text, and he began the work of reading backward through what she had found, the way a tracker reads a trail, not from where you are to where you're going, but from where you are to where it started, because that was always where the truth lived. It took him 20 minutes to understand the outline of it. It took another 10 to understand why she'd been afraid to tell him in the hall. I was still standing at the table, very still, when the senior archivist arrived. An elderly man named Perith, gray-haired and blinking with the disorientation of someone pulled from sleep, wearing a heavy robe over what were clearly his night clothes, and carrying the expression of a man trying to determine whether he was in trouble or simply being asked a question. "My king," Pereth's voice was careful. "I was told it was urgent. These documents." Draven gestured at the table without moving from his position beside it. "When were they last accessed before tonight?" Perith moved to the table with the automatic deference of a man who had spent 50 years treating old documents as the most important things in any room. He looked at the 3 items without touching them, his eyes moving from the genealogical records to the older text with its altered seal, and something in his face shifted in a way that was subtle enough that most people would have missed it. Draven did not miss it. When? Draven said again. Pereth looked up. He was a careful man, which meant he was the kind of man who understood when carefully became a liability. The genealogical records, those are accessed periodically. Standard historical research. The lineage historians pull them for ongoing records updates, perhaps twice yearly. And the third document, a beat. That one is restricted access, my personal key only. And when was it last accessed? The archivist's hands, which had been moving toward the document with the habitual reaching gesture of a man about to handle something he managed, stopped. I haven't opened that case in, he paused, 7 years, approximately. Then how is it on this table? Pereth looked at the document, then at Draven, then at the document again, and the sequence of expressions that crossed his face, the succession of small recalculations, was the face of a man realizing that a thing he had decided was safely buried had been excavated while he wasn't watching. I don't know, he said, too carefully. Try again. My king, I genuinely... Pereth. Draven's voice did not rise. It never rose. It did the thing it did instead, which was to become quieter and more precise, the way a blade is more dangerous for being narrow. I have a missing woman, blood on a balcony, and a document that requires your personal key sitting open on a table you haven't touched in 7 years. You're going to tell me what you know, or I'm going to spend the next hour determining what you know by methods that will be significantly less comfortable for both of us. The archivist's hands dropped to his sides. The careful expression had gone. What was underneath it was fear, straightforward, unmanaged, the kind that appears when a man has been running a calculation for years and has suddenly realized the numbers don't cover the situation he's in. I was told, Pereth said slowly, that the document would be needed for a verification, a bloodline verification, that someone would retrieve it, consult it, and return it. Told by whom? I was told it would be better for everyone if I didn't know specifically. Pereth, Lord Varys. It came out flat and fast, the sound of a man releasing something heavy. He came to me 3 weeks ago. He said there was a historical matter being resolved at the council level, that certain lineage documentation would need to be cross-referenced as part of a succession protocol review. The storm pressed against the palace above them in a long, low vibration. Draven said nothing. He stood with his hands at his sides and the pendant still in his left fist, and the 4 words Selene had written visible at the edge of his peripheral vision, and he let Pereth hear the silence of a man who was assembling something in real time. He said it was standard, Pereth continued. He has the authority to commission archive reviews. He has the authority to request reviews, Draven said. He does not have the authority to access restricted documents without my countersignature. You know that. Pereth's jaw worked. Yes. And you gave it to him anyway. He indicated a breath. He indicated that you were aware of the matter, that it was simply a question of not burdening you with administrative detail during the campaign period. Draven looked at him for a long moment, long enough that Pereth, who had served 3 decades in the palace and was not an unintelligent man, understood in full the weight of what he'd just described, that he had been used carefully and precisely by someone who had learned the exact argument required to move him, and that his usefulness to that person had now ended. You're going to write down everything Varys said to you, Draven said. Every conversation, every instruction, every detail you remember, including what he was wearing and what time of day it was. You're going to do it tonight before you sleep again, and you're going to give it to Korath by the 2nd hour. He paused. And you're going to stay in your quarters until I tell you otherwise. Pereth nodded with the rapid compliance of a man grateful not to be in chains. Of course. Yes. My king, I want you to know that if I had understood what he intended... Write it down, Draven said. Go. The archivist went. Draven stood alone in the archive with the documents and the lamp and the storm overhead, and for approximately 30 seconds, he allowed himself the internal calculation without the management layer, let himself feel the full architecture of what had happened tonight, the precision of it, the planning that had gone into it, the fact that the storm was not weather and Selene's disappearance was not random, and someone inside his own palace had spent weeks preparing this with a specificity that required knowing exactly what she had found, or knowing she would find it, which meant either they had directed her here or they had watched her discover it and decided the timing was right to move. Either way, they had known about her. Either way, they had been watching. He folded the 3 documents with precise care and placed them inside his jacket, against his chest, where they could not be accessed without going through him first. He took the lamp. He walked out of the archive and up through the palace to the war room where his generals were waiting, and he did not let any of it show on his face, because showing it would give whoever was watching something to read, and he was done letting people inside his defenses. The war room had 7 men in it, senior commanders, all of them. Men he had chosen, men who had served under him in the field, men whose faces he knew, the way you know the faces of people you have watched, make decisions under conditions that strip everything unnecessary away. He stood at the head of the table and looked at each of them in turn, and made the calculation he'd learned to make early in his reign. Not who was loyal, because loyalty was a thing you earned and lost and rebuilt, but who was currently aligned and where the seams were. The healer is missing, he said. Not because any of them didn't know. The lockdown had communicated that clearly enough, but because naming it directly was the first act of control. She did not leave voluntarily. There is evidence of a struggle on the east balcony. I want every movement logged from the second hour of celebration until now, where every person in this room was, who they spoke to, who they dispatched. Commander Aldrath, the oldest man in the room and the most politically careful of them, said, "Are you treating this as an abduction or an assassination attempt?" "I'm treating it as both until I have evidence that eliminates one." "And the storm?" "Not natural." Draven looked at him. "I want your weather mages. We have 2 and neither of them—" "I want them examined," Draven said. "Not their weather abilities, their recent movements, who they spoke to, whether anyone has offered them anything in the last month." He moved his eyes down the table. "Kaelin." The intelligence officer straightened. "My king." "The outer markets, the underground passage network beneath the eastern quarter. I want every informant contact active by the 4th hour. I want to know if anyone moved anything, or anyone, through those channels tonight. There are 47 active passage routes we know of," Kaelin said, "and probably twice that we don't." "Then start with the ones we know." Draven put both hands flat on the table. She was on that balcony within 30 minutes of leaving the hall. That means the window for moving her out of the immediate palace perimeter, if that's what happened, is narrow. If she was taken, they couldn't have had her far from the palace walls before I locked the gates. "Unless the storm was cover for a river exit," said Commander Veth, the youngest at the table, a direct man with the habit of saying the thing others were approaching obliquely. "The river gate is technically outside the city wall lock system. The chain mechanism is under whose jurisdiction?" A brief silence. "Lord Assessor Varys oversees the harbor and river access infrastructure." The name landed in the room with the specific weight of a thing everyone had been aware of, but no one had yet said. Draven watched the faces. 3 of them flickered with something, not guilt, but the recognition of a connection they'd been about to make themselves. 2 showed nothing. 2 showed the careful blankness of men who were deciding what to show. He noted all of it and showed none of it on his own face. "Where's Varys now?" he said. "His quarters," Korath said from the door, where he'd returned. "I had him located when you gave the lockdown order. He's been in his quarters since the 8th hour. His steward confirms it." "His steward?" "Yes. Have someone outside his steward's chain verify that." Draven looked at Korath with the direct communication of 2 men who had worked together long enough not to need every word spoken. "Someone Varys has no prior relationship with." Korath nodded once and was gone again. The 7 commanders looked at their king across the war table and made their individual calculations. Draven let them. He needed to see who would speak next and what they would say, because that data was as useful as anything the informants would bring back in 2 hours. It was Aldrath who spoke. "My king, if this connects to Varys, if this is an inside operation, then we're not looking at a simple abduction." He said it with the measured delivery of a man stating the obvious, because sometimes the obvious needed to be stated. That level of coordination, from inside the palace, during a celebration that brought every Alpha Lord and their contingents into the city. He paused. "This is a play for the throne." "Yes," Draven said. Another silence. Shorter this time. "Then Selene Vera," Aldrath continued, with the clinical tone of a man who had learned to discuss painful things clinically, because that was how you discussed them usefully, "is either bait, or she's a piece of something larger that someone doesn't want you to have." Draven looked at him. "She's both," he said. "She found something in the archive tonight. something someone needed either destroyed or controlled before it could be presented to me. His hand pressed slightly against the front of his jacket, against the documents folded there. She's alive. Someone went through significant effort to remove her from this palace without killing her in place, which means she has value that her death would eliminate. What did she find? Veth asked. Draven looked at him. That's not your question to ask tonight. Veth accepted this without argument, which was one of the things Draven valued about him. Find her, Draven said. Not loudly. Not with the performance of urgency, because performance was for men who needed other men to believe in their seriousness. He said it the way he said things that were simply the final word on what happened next. Everything else is secondary. The conspiracy, the politics, the council implications, all of it waits until she's back inside these walls. Find her. The room moved, and in the quiet after the commanders filed out, before Korath came back with the next report, and the knight's machinery fully engaged, Draven stood alone at the war table and opened his left hand and looked at the broken pendant. The silver was cold now, all the warmth gone. He closed his fingers around it again and walked back into the war that his own house had started, and the thing behind his sternum that was not pain and was not strategy, and was not anything he had a language for burned with the specific heat of a man who has understood, too late and too clearly, that he has been protecting everything except the one thing he could not afford to lose. 2 floors above the archive, behind a door that was officially locked and had been for 11 years, a figure moved through the secret passage that connected the old East Tower to the river stair. The figure carried a sealed document case and moved quickly, without light, by memory of a route they had walked many times in preparation for exactly this night. Behind them, faint and distant, the sounds of the lockdown, shouted orders, boots on stone, the metallic percussion of gates being secured, filled the palace above like the noise of a tide coming in. The figure did not slow. They reached the stair. They descended. At the bottom, where the passage opened onto the river channel that ran beneath the city's eastern wall, a boat was waiting, barely visible in the storm-dark water, holding 2 figures who had been there for 3 hours and whose patience meant they had known exactly how long it would take. The sealed case was handed across. No words. The boat pushed off from the stone landing. The figure watched it go. Then they turned and walked back up the river stair, back through the dark passage, back toward the palace interior. And by the time they entered the east corridor, they were walking at the unhurried pace of someone returning from a late errand, and their expression was the expression of someone who had nothing in particular to hide. Because the most dangerous move in the game they were playing was not the one they'd just made. It was the one Draven didn't know was coming, and it was already in motion. The report came at the 3rd hour of the morning, delivered by a man whose boots were soaked through and whose hands shook slightly. Not from cold, but from the specific tremor of someone who has run hard and has bad news and knows it. Draven read it standing at the war table. He read it once, set it down, and read it again. The second reading was not because he had failed to understand the first. It was because the first reading had done something to the architecture inside his chest that required a moment of stillness to manage before he could be useful again. Korath watched him from across the table and said nothing, which was the correct choice. The report was from Kalen's network in the Eastern Quarter. 3 informants, independent sources, all confirming the same movement. A riverboat, small, fast, had exited through the channel beneath the eastern wall at approximately the time the storm hit its peak intensity, when the watch rotation had been disrupted by the violence of the weather, and the 2 men assigned to the river gate access had both, independently, moved to cover the adjacent storm drain overflow which had been flooding the lower passage. A flooding event that Kalen's informants noted had never occurred in any previous storm of comparable severity because the drain had been modified 3 weeks ago. A modification logged in the infrastructure records under a routine maintenance order, countersigned by Lord Assessor Varys. The riverboat had been tracked by a night fisherman sheltering under the eastern bridge. It had carried 3 people. One of them, the fisherman reported, had been wrapped in a dark cloak and had not moved of their own accord during the brief window he'd observed the vessel. Not moving of their own accord. Draven put the report down for the second time and stood with his hands flat on the table and looked at the map of the river system. The routes outward, the points where the waterway split and diversified into the delta channels that spread through the lowlands east of the city toward the border territories where his jurisdiction became porous and his reach became a matter of speed rather than authority. 12 hours. At the current river current with the storm pushing water volume, a fast boat could be 60 miles from the city in 12 hours. Past the virulent tributary split, into the border marsh territories where three different exiled clan networks operated outside the reach of any formal treaty, 60 miles. He had locked the roads. He had locked the city gates. He had not, in the first minutes of understanding that she was gone, thought to lock the river, because the river lock required Varys's countersignature on the harbor authority order, and Varys had been in his quarters with his steward confirming it, and by the time the independent verification Draven had ordered came back clean, because Varys had been in his quarters, had been there all evening, had an impeccable record of physical presence. The boat had been gone for 90 minutes. The lock was clean. The alibi was clean. The infrastructure modification was 3 weeks old and buried in routine paperwork. Clean. All of it clean. That was the thing that settled into Draven's understanding now with the weight of something structural. Not the anger, not yet, but the specific recognition of planning, of patience, of someone who had spent not days but months constructing a sequence of moves that looked like maintenance orders and routine protocols and nothing worth noticing. All of it designed to create exactly this, a gap, small as a needle, through which everything critical could be extracted, while the king stood in his own war room and held a report and understood that he had been managed. He had been managed. The word didn't feel like anger. It felt like standing on a floor he'd believed was stone and finding it had been ice the entire time. Varys, he said. He's still in his quarters, Korth said. 2 men on the door since the second hour. Bring him here. You want him in the war room. I want him in front of me. Draven straightened. His jaw was set at the angle Korth knew, but there was something different under it tonight. Something that was not the controlled cold of a man directing a military operation, but the specific stillness of a man who has passed through the cold into something on the other side of it. Now, Korth went. Draven looked at the map for 3 minutes and used those 3 minutes with the precision of a man who understood that the next hour would not allow for uncalibrated responses. He located himself in the problem the way he located himself in a battle, not from the center of his own position, but from overhead, from the full shape of the terrain, from what his enemy knew he knew, and what they believed he hadn't yet understood. They had taken Selene because she'd found the documents. That was the first move. Remove the information from his immediate access. Remove the person who could interpret it. Create a window in which the documents themselves could be retrieved and destroyed. But the documents were in his jacket, against his chest. Had been for 2 hours, which meant they didn't know he'd gone to the archive. They'd expected him to go to the balcony, which he had. They'd expected the balcony to consume him, the blood, the pendant, the shock of absence, long enough to delay his movements by the hour they needed to clean the archive before morning. They had not accounted for him going directly to the archive before the war room, which he had only done because the pressure behind his sternum that was not strategy had told him something was wrong before he'd finished reading the scene on the balcony. They had not accounted for instinct. They had planned against his mind and not calculated for what lived underneath it. The documents were safe. Selene was 60 miles downriver. And somewhere in this palace, the person who had walked back up from the river stair was now sleeping with the practiced ease of someone who believed the operation was complete. Lord Varys arrived at the war room in 17 minutes, which was fast enough to mean he'd been awake when the guards knocked. He was dressed, fully, carefully, not in haste, but in the composed manner of a man who had anticipated being summoned and had used the time to prepare his surface. A heavy wool coat, his assessor's chain of office, his silver-handled walking stick that he carried not from necessity, but from the habit of carrying something that could be set down deliberately when he wanted to communicate ease. He set it against the wall beside the door when he entered, with deliberate ease, and looked at Draven across the war table with the expression of a man arriving at a meeting he had been incorrectly interrupted for, mild, attentive, faintly inconvenienced. 50 years old. Survivor of 4 reigns, eyes that were the pale flat brown of river silt. Not unintelligent, not vacant, but the color of something that didn't reflect much light back. "My king," he said. "I was told it was urgent." Draven looked at him for a long moment without speaking. He had learned in his 20s that silence was a tool most men could not tolerate, that they filled it with whatever they were carrying, that the first thing someone said into an extended silence was almost always more useful than what they'd prepared to say. Varys did not fill the silence. He held it with the practiced patience of a man who had played this game longer than Draven had been alive. That told Draven something. The Rivergate, Draven said finally. The drainage modification. The maintenance order from 3 weeks ago. Varys's expression did not change in any measurable way. The infrastructure review, he said. Yes. There was a series of maintenance updates to the lower river passage, standard pre-winter work, given the historical flooding pattern along the Your countersignature is on the modification order. I countersign dozens of infrastructure orders monthly. It's within my assessor's remit to... The modification created a gap in the Rivergate watch rotation, Draven said. During the storm tonight, that gap was used to move a vessel out of the city with at least one person aboard who was not moving voluntarily. A beat. The first beat that had been slightly too long. That's a serious accusation, Varys said. It's an observation. Draven moved around the table, not fast, not aggressive, but with the deliberate displacement of space that large men with authority use when they want the geometry of a room to say what words haven't yet. The accusation comes after you explain to me how a maintenance modification you personally authorized created a precise operational window during the exact window in which my healer was taken from this palace. Varys's eyes followed him with the careful tracking of a man who was recalculating. Coincidence and conspiracy are not... Don't! The word was quiet and flat and had the quality of a door closing. Don't give me the statesman's answer. I've been receiving statesman's answers from you for 8 years, and I've been patient with them because they were usually attached to work that served the throne. Tonight is different. Tonight you're going to talk to me like one man to another, which means you're going to drop whatever you prepared on the walk here and tell me something true. Varys looked at him. The silt-colored eyes did their calculation. The walking stick stood against the wall. The silver assessor's chain caught the lamplight and threw it back in small, cold points. I don't know what you think I've done, Varys said. I think you've spent several months preparing a sequence of administrative maneuvers designed to extract a specific piece of lineage information from this palace before I could act on it, and that tonight you used the celebration as cover to execute the final stage, which included removing the one person who had found and understood that information. Draven stopped moving. He was 6 feet from Varys now, and the distance had the quality of a held weapon. I think you've been serving someone else's interest from inside my court for long enough that you've stopped distinguishing between their survival and yours. And I think the only question remaining is, how many people in this room helped you do it? The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It had texture. It had the specific weight of a man standing on the edge of a decision about what to cost himself. The bloodline document, Varys said finally, not loudly, with the tone of a man who had decided to trade one dangerous truth for the possibility of surviving the night. You've read it. Every word. Then you understand what it means, what she represents. He said it without heat, analytically, the way he said things when he was being most honest. If that lineage is legitimate, and I have reason to believe it is, then Selene Veyra holds a blood claim to this throne that supersedes 3 generations of Kael's succession. Every Alpha Lord in the Alliance has a legal basis to challenge your rule the moment it becomes public knowledge. I know what it means, Draven said. Then you know why it can't be allowed to surface. What I know, Draven said, is that you made that decision for me, without my knowledge, without my authority. His voice had dropped to the register it reached only when he was very close to the thing underneath the cold, and every man who had served beside him knew that register as the most dangerous one he had. You decided what the king needed to be protected from, and you moved against someone in my house, and you did it by exploiting the access I gave you. Varys's jaw tightened, the first visible break in the composed surface. I did what the throne required. You did what you decided it required. Draven stepped forward. That is not the same thing. It has never been the same thing. And every man who has confused those 2 sentences has ended badly in this kingdom, because when you substitute your judgment for mine on a matter of this magnitude, you are not serving the throne. You are replacing it. Varys straightened. Something behind his expression had shifted. Not fear, not yet, but the particular recalibration of a man who has played a long game and is now calculating whether the board still looks the way he thought it did. There are others involved, he said, and the words were both confession and warning simultaneously. People with resources and reach that extend well outside your borders. If something happens to me tonight, something is happening to you tonight, Draven said. The question is what shape it takes. Draven. Varys used his name without title, the first time in 8 years, which was the move of a man abandoning protocol because protocol had run out. Think about what I'm telling you. If this goes to open confrontation, if you arrest me, if you make this visible, everyone connected to this operation becomes a liability. They will move to protect themselves. That means Selene Vera becomes a problem to be eliminated rather than a peace to be held. The room was very quiet. That was the thing underneath all the architecture of the night. That was the actual blade, and Varys had just held it up where both of them could see it clearly, which meant he was either desperate enough to threaten or smart enough to know that the only leverage he had left was the one thing Draven could not call a bluff on. She's alive because she's valuable. She stops being valuable the moment this becomes irrecoverable. Draven looked at Varys and felt the thing behind his sternum go very still. Not the stillness of cold, not the stillness of control, but the stillness of a man who has just understood the full shape of the trap he's standing in and is deciding, in real time, what kind of man he needs to become to walk out of it. The king he had been for 11 years would have had Varys in chains before the sentence finished, would have treated the threat as a military problem, would have applied the same logic he applied to every obstacle. Overwhelming force, immediate resolution, no negotiation with anything that positioned itself as leverage against him. That king would have lost Selene before sunrise. He stood at the war table in the 3rd hour of a morning that had been a celebration 8 hours ago, with blood on a balcony and documents against his chest, and a man in front of him who had just explained with perfect clarity that the tools he'd built his entire reign around would destroy the one thing he was trying to protect if he used them. "Tell me who has her," he said. His voice was different. Not the command register, not the cold management tone. Something underneath both of those. Something that had not been audible in his voice in a very long time, if ever. "Tell me who has her, and where she's being taken, and what they want." Varys heard the difference. His eyes moved across Draven's face with the attention of a man reading a text he'd expected to be in one language and was finding in another. "You're not going to arrest me," Varys said slowly. It was not a question. "Tell me what I want to know." "And then what?" "And then we discuss what your continued survival is worth and what it costs you." Draven held his eyes. "But only after I know where she is." A long moment. The lamp burned. The storm overhead had thinned to a steady rain, the violence of it spent, leaving behind only the persistent gray sound of water on stone. Varys made his calculation. He had been making calculations for 50 years and surviving on their accuracy, and this one, the one that determined whether the king across the table was bargaining from strength or from the rawer and less predictable place that Varys had, until this moment, not believed existed inside him. This one required him to be right the first time. He looked at Draven's face, at the jaw and the gray eyes and the broken pendant visible now at the edge of his closed left hand where he'd stopped managing the detail of concealing it. The Lord Assessor, who had survived 4 reigns through the careful application of political mathematics, made his decision. "The warlord Cassith Drool," he said, "the northern border faction. He has 3 staging camps in the virulent marsh. She'll be at the second one. It's the only one with a healer's facility, and Drool's people were instructed to bring her in intact." He paused. "He wants a meeting, a formal council. He wants the bloodline claim presented publicly before the full Alpha Alliance, with Selene as living proof, and he wants you removed from power constitutionally rather than through open war, because open war costs him men he can't replace. He thinks the bloodline claim removes me. It destabilizes you. In the current political climate, with 3 Alpha Lords already questioning the succession after your Eastern campaign." Varys stopped. "He thinks it's enough." Draven looked at him. "How long has he had access to your communications?" A breath. "Long enough." "How long?" 4 years. 4 years. The number landed with the weight of a structural failure. The specific sound of something important collapsing that had been holding weight for a long time. 4 years of war council meetings and border strategy discussions and resource allocation debates and intelligence assessments, all of it reaching Cassith Drool through the man who had been standing closest to the throne. 4 years of being known. Draven stood with that knowledge for exactly as long as it took to metabolize it into something he could use, which was less time than it would have taken most men, because he had learned very early that the paralysis of betrayal was a luxury only the people who hadn't built anything worth betraying could afford. Drool wants a council meeting, he said. Yes. Tell me exactly how that request was going to be delivered, and when, Varys told him. And as he listened, Draven felt the shape of a different kind of move forming. Not the move of a king responding to a threat, but the move of a man who had just understood that the rules of the board he'd been playing on were not the rules he'd assumed, and that changing the rules entirely was the only play that protected what he could not afford to lose. It would require him to do something he had never done in 11 years of rule. It would require him to be vulnerable on purpose, in public, before every Alpha Lord in the Alliance. It would require him to set down every weapon he had ever used to make men fear him, and stand in front of the most dangerous gathering of power in the known territory and tell the truth. The thought of it was worse than any battlefield he had ever walked onto. He was going to do it anyway. He rode out before dawn with 11 men, not an army, not the assembled force of a king mobilizing the full weight of his military authority. 11 men, chosen in the 20 minutes between Varys finishing his account and Draven walking to the stables, chosen by the single criterion that mattered in this particular operation, which was not rank or combat record, but the simpler and more absolute question of who would ride into the virulent marsh in a pre-dawn storm on the king's word alone, without orders written down, without the formal sanction of the War Council, without any of the institutional architecture that normally gave men permission to do dangerous things. Korath was one of them, which surprised no one. Veth was one of them, which surprised several people and confirmed what Draven had assessed across the war table 3 hours earlier. The other 9 were soldiers, not officers, not commanders, not men with political weight or career calculations to protect. Men who had ridden with Draven in the field and understood, in the wordless way that shared danger creates understanding, that when he moved like this, stripped down, fast, without ceremony, it meant the thing he was moving toward was real, in a way that official operations often weren't. No one asked him to explain. That was the compact, and it held. They cleared the city through the service gate at the northern approach, which required no counter-signature from anyone, and picked up the river road in the gray pre-dawn dark. With the rain still coming down in the thin, steady way, it came after a major storm had spent itself. Not violent anymore, just persistent, the sky's long exhale after the violence was done. Draven rode at the front. He had changed out of the celebration clothing and was in field gear now, dark wool, riding leather, the longer blade he used in serious work rather than the short ceremonial piece. The pendant was still in his left breast pocket, where he'd moved it from his fist somewhere around the second hour. He could feel it against his sternum with each stride of the horse, a small specific pressure that was not pain and was not comfort, but was simply present, the way certain things are present when you've stopped pretending they aren't. 60 miles of river road in pre-dawn darkness, with 11 men behind him and a marsh territory ahead, where a warlord was holding the one person who had found the truth he needed and been taken for it. The math of the situation was not complicated. The execution was everything. He had used Varys's information to construct the approach in his head during the ride out through the city, the second staging camp in the virulent marsh, which he knew from border surveys as a defensible position on elevated ground above the floodline, accessible by the river approach, or by the marsh road that ran from the eastern tributary crossing. Cassith Drool was not a reckless man. He would have guards on both approaches. He would have the camp structured so that any aggressive move against it could be answered before a large force closed the distance. Against a large force, that structure worked. Against 11 men moving fast and quiet in pre-dawn dark, it was a different problem. They covered the first 20 miles before the sky began to differentiate, the darkness going from black to the deep gray blue that preceded actual dawn. The river beside the road becoming visible as a moving darkness rather than simply a sound. The rain thinned further. Draven's hands on the reins were wet and cold, and he registered this without addressing it, the way he registered discomfort in the field, noted, categorized as non-critical, set aside. At the tributary crossing, he pulled up. Korath came alongside him. 2 miles to the marsh road turnoff. I know. Draven was looking at the crossing, the bridge, the approaches, the sightlines from the elevated bank on the far side. Drool's people will have the marsh road watched from the high ground above the second bend. If we take the road, we're visible 4 minutes before we reach the camp perimeter. We go through the marsh, Korath said. Not a question. Through the marsh, he looked at the 11 men behind him, men who had ridden hard through the dark without complaint, and were now looking at him with the expressions of people who understood they were about to get significantly more uncomfortable. On foot from the east bank, single file, I lead. You lead, Korath repeated, with the tone of a man noting this for the record. She's in there because of me, Draven said. It came out flat and factual, the tone of a man stating the coordinates of a target, except it wasn't flat in the way his voice was usually flat. There was something underneath it that Korath recognized as the kind of honesty that only emerged in the specific exhaustion of a long night where the layers of performance had been stripped away one by accumulating cost. I lead. No one argued. They crossed and dismounted, leaving the horses with 2 men on the bank, and went into the verdant marsh on foot, in single file with Draven at the front, and the gray dawn coming up slowly through the reed grass, and the water pulling at their boots with every step. The marsh had the smell of deep standing water and decay, and something organic and alive that existed independent of weather. The smell of a place that had been wet for 1,000 years and intended to remain so. The ground was not solid. It was a negotiation, each step a question about whether the surface would hold, answered in the fraction of a second before the weight committed. Moving fast was impossible. Moving quietly was a matter of patience and suppressed urgency, and the specific discipline of accepting that the ground would dictate the pace regardless of what the situation required. Draven moved through it with the focused attention of a man who had learned long ago that the mind's tendency to run ahead to the destination was the primary cause of mistakes in difficult terrain. He kept himself here: boot placement, reed grass, water depth, the direction of the faint lightning in the sky that told him east, the sound of the marsh, which was constant and indifferent and useful for covering sound. Behind him, 11 men who trusted him enough to walk into pre-dawn marsh on his word. That trust had a weight he felt differently tonight than he had ever felt it before. Not as the natural consequence of rank, not as the product of fear-based loyalty, but as something that had been chosen, specifically, by each of these men in full understanding of the cost. The distinction had always existed. He was only now, at 34, in the gray marsh dawn with a woman's broken pendant against his chest, understanding it clearly enough to feel its actual shape. Men followed him because they were afraid of what happened if they didn't, and men followed him because they believed in where he was going. The first kind were useful. The second kind were what an army actually was, underneath all the logistics and strategy. He had spent 11 years building the first kind and receiving the second kind as a consequence he hadn't fully accounted for. I was accounting for it now in the only way that mattered, by being the thing they'd apparently decided he was, regardless of his own accounting. The camp appeared through the reed grass at a distance of perhaps 200 yards. Fires visible first, the orange-red points of light in the gray dawn that meant guards awake and warming themselves, which meant the camp was active and alert, and the element of surprise was already a calculation rather than an assumption. Low structures, 2 larger ones and 4 smaller, arranged on the elevated ground above the marsh with the specific practical logic of a military encampment. Sight lines covered, approach routes exposed, the arrangement of a man who had built camps in contested territory before. Draven stopped and let the men behind him close the distance until Korath was at his shoulders. 12 visible, Korath said, very low, probably another 6 inside. Selene is in the larger structure on the left, Draven said. He said it with a certainty that was not guess. The structure on the left had a different quality of light behind its shuttered window, steadier and brighter than firelight, the kind that came from a working lamp in a space being actively used. A healer's facility, Varys had said. Of course she was awake. Of course she was working, if there was anyone there who needed it, because that was simply what she did. She found the need and she addressed it, regardless of her own situation. The thought of it moved through him with a quality he didn't name. We need a distraction on the east approach, Draven said. Something that pulls the perimeter guards without triggering a full alert. 3 minutes. That's all I need, Veth said from behind Korath's shoulder. I can give you the distraction. He said it with the directness of a man stating a logistical fact. But it'll be loud. Loud is fine, Draven said. Loud from the east while we come through the north reed line. He looked at Korath. The moment I'm inside that structure, your only objective is the gate on the south side. Keep it open. Whatever happens inside, I need a clear exit. And Drool? Korath asked. Drool is the man standing between me and that door, Draven said. We'll address it in sequence. He moved before anyone could say anything else that required answering, cutting left through the reed grass toward the northern approach with 4 men behind him, low and fast as the marsh ground allowed, using the pre-dawn gray the way he'd learned to use every available piece of terrain, not as an obstacle, but as a tool, as cover, as the specific advantage of a man who had stopped waiting for conditions to improve and started using the conditions that existed. The distraction came in the form of a burning torch thrown into the eastern dry grass berm, which caught fast and bright and spectacular enough that every guard on the east perimeter turned toward it simultaneously, the way human attention always moved toward fire, the ancient reflex that superseded training. In the 7 seconds that followed, Draven crossed the last 30 yards of open ground at a dead run. He hit the door of the left structure shoulder first, and the latch gave, and he was inside before the door finished swinging, blade out, the full situational read happening in the fraction of a second it took his eyes to adjust. A long, low room, 2 lampstands, a rough table with medical implements arranged on it with the characteristic precision of Celine's working method, and in the far corner, a man with a short blade already drawn who had been standing guard inside and was reacting to the entry with the reflexes of someone who'd been expecting trouble from outside, not from a single man crashing through the door from 12 feet away at full speed. Draven crossed the room in 3 strides and the fight lasted approximately 8 seconds, which was roughly the length of time it took for the guard to realize that the man hitting him was not making the adjustments a normal combatant made. The small protective instincts, the self-preserving angles, the half-second hesitations that every fighter introduced when their own body was at risk. Draven was fighting with none of those. He was fighting with the specific recklessness of a man for whom the calculation of personal risk had simply stopped functioning, and that absence was more disorienting to face than any technique. The guard went down. Not dead. Down, hard, in a way that would keep him down. Draven straightened and looked at the room properly. Celine was at the far end, her wrists bound to a structural post with rope. Not cruelly, not tight enough to damage. The practical restraint of men who needed her contained rather than hurt. She was standing, which told him she'd been standing since they brought her here rather than sit on the floor. Her face was dirty, and her hair had come entirely loose, and there was a bruise developing along her left cheekbone that made something in his jaw tighten so sharply it was almost a sound. She was looking at him with those dark eyes that held things. "You came alone," she said. "I came with 11 men," he said, moving to the post and drawing his short blade for the rope. 11 is alone in this context. "Draven, are you hurt?" Not a question, an assessment request. The distinction was in how he looked at her. Not at the bruise first, but at the way she was standing, the weight distribution, the breathing, the hands. "The face is from the initial struggle," she said. "Nothing else. They needed me functional." A pause, 1 breath. "How did you find me this fast?" "Varys told me where you were." Something moved across her expression. "Varys. He's currently in a room in the palace deciding what his cooperation is worth." He got through the rope, and her hands came free and she moved them forward with the controlled, careful motion of someone whose circulation had been compromised for several hours. He took her wrists and checked the skin, and she let him, which was itself a form of information. "We don't have long. I need to get you through the north reed line before—" The door opened. Not the door he'd come through. The interior door at the back of the room, which connected to the main camp structure. And the man who came through it was not a guard. Cassith Drool was perhaps 45, built lean and hard in the way of men who had spent their lives in border territories where excess of any kind was a liability. Gray-bearded, dark-eyed, wearing the practical gear of a camp commander rather than anything that suggested ceremony. He had 2 men behind him and a blade at his hip that he had not drawn, which was either confidence or calculation, or both. He looked at the guard on the floor, at the cut rope, at Draven, who was standing between him and Celine with the short blade still in his hand, and the particular quality of stillness that Draven had when he had finished moving fast and was now simply present in a situation, fully, with nothing held in reserve. Drool's eyes moved to Celine. "You're faster than I expected." "Most people make that mistake," Draven said. "Once." "I have 14 men in this camp," Drool said. Not a threat. A fact, stated in the tone of a man presenting the terms of a situation. "You have significantly fewer, and the exits are currently being managed by my people," Draven said, "who have instructions not to start a war unless it starts itself." Drool looked at him with the assessing eyes of a man who had spent decades reading the gap between what people said and what they intended. You came into my camp with 11 men to take her back, he said. That's not a king making a military decision. That's something else. It's the only decision that made sense. It's a decision that tells me everything I wanted to know about why the bloodline document matters. Drool moved to the side of the room, not toward them, but to the wall. The move of a man establishing a position from which he can talk without the pressure of proximity. You've read it. I've read it. Then you know what she is, what she represents. His voice was not hostile. That was the thing that was hardest to navigate. Drool speaking without the anger of an enemy, but with the steady conviction of a man who believed he was correct. The Kale succession is built on a lineage claim that your great-grandfather established by suppressing the existing blood right. The document proves it. If it goes before the full Alpha Alliance, it will go before the full Alpha Alliance, Draven said. Drool stopped. The two men behind him shifted. The silence in the room had changed shape. You're going to present it yourself, Drool said slowly, at the Moon Council. 3 weeks. Draven lowered the short blade, not sheathed, but lowered, the deliberate physical signal of a man who has decided the conversation is more important than the weapons. Every Alpha Lord in the Alliance, every succession claim, every legal question about the blood right, all of it, publicly, before the Council. Drool was looking at him with an expression that was rereading something it had already read and finding the text different the second time. You'd be putting the legitimacy of your own throne on the floor of the Council. Yes. That's political suicide if the Council rules against the Kyle claim. Yes, Draven said again, with the same flatness, the same absolute absence of qualification. Why? Not rhetorically, genuinely, in the voice of a man who had prepared for many versions of this conversation and had not prepared for this one. Draven looked at him. Then he did something he had not done in 11 years in a room with an adversary, which was to answer a direct question with the direct truth, rather than the strategically useful version of it. Because she deserves to have the truth spoken out loud, he said. And because any throne worth keeping doesn't need to be protected by suppressing what's real. The room held that answer for a long moment. Then Drool looked at Celine. And you? His voice had shifted, still careful, but different. What do you want from this? Celine, who had been still and silent since Draven lowered the blade, looked at Drool with the directness she had never once dropped for anyone. I want to stand in front of that council on my own terms, not dragged there as evidence, not presented as a weapon. Her voice was steady and clear and carried no performance in it. On my terms. Drool's jaw moved. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, the kind that happened when the position you'd spent months building was being dismantled not by force, but by something you hadn't constructed a defense against because you hadn't believed it existed. If I let you walk out of here, he said, and the council convenes and the Kyle claim is challenged, you understand what that means for the stability of... The wall behind Drool exploded inward, not metaphorically. The wooden structure of the rear wall, which had been built for a temporary camp and not for the impact of 4 men hitting it simultaneously from outside with the combined momentum of a coordinated breach, gave way in a splintering crash of timber and rope lashing, and through it came Korath and 3 others, blades drawn, moving fast and low with the instinctive professional efficiency of men who had done this particular kind of work before. Drool's 2 guards reacted. The room became very loud and very small for approximately 45 seconds. The specific duration of close-quarters combat in a space that didn't accommodate it, all elbows and blades and bodies colliding with furniture and walls, the sounds of it ugly and percussive and nothing like the stories that got told about it afterward. Draven put himself between the combat and Celine. Not because she needed him to, she had already moved, with the practical instinct of someone who'd assessed the room's geometry the moment she entered it, to the position behind the overturned table that provided cover and an angle toward the door. But because the act of putting his body between her and the thing trying to reach her was not a strategic choice. It was the only choice that made sense to him. The only one that had made sense since the moment he'd stood on a wet balcony and understood what her absence felt like. One of Drool's guards came through the furniture toward him, and Draven met him with the blade and the reckless certainty of a man whose personal risk calculation had ceased to function as a limiting factor, and the fight was brief and conclusive, and cost him a cut across his left forearm that he noticed the way he noticed the cold in his hands. Registered, non-critical, set aside. Then it was over. The room was standing. Drool was against the far wall with Korath's blade at his throat, and the specific expression of a man who had run his calculation to its end and found the result. Draven was breathing hard, sweat and rain and blood, the cut on his forearm bleeding in a thin, steady line down to his fingers, and the lamp still burning on the stand, completely indifferent to all of it. He looked at Korath. Not his throat. Korath moved the blade back an inch. Draven looked at Drool. The council, he said, between controlled breaths. 3 weeks. Bring your evidence. Bring your legal arguments. Bring every Alpha Lord you've been corresponding with about the bloodline claim. He looked him in the eyes. But she walks out of here now. And this ends as a political matter, not a military one. Drool looked at him for a long moment. Blood from one of the fallen guards was spreading across the floor between them. Outside the wrecked wall, the eastern fire had burned down to coals, and the marsh was going pale with early morning light, and somewhere in the reed grass. Draven's 11 men were waiting for whatever direction he was about to give. 3 weeks, Drool said. 3 weeks, Draven confirmed. Then he turned to Celine. She was standing behind the table, upright, unhurt, looking at him with the dark eyes that held things. And the thing they were holding now was complicated in the way that real things were complicated. Not one feeling, but several, layered and simultaneous. The kind of expression that happened when a person had been through enough in a short span of hours that their face couldn't simplify it anymore. He crossed the room to her. She looked at the cut on his forearm, at his hands, at his face in the rapid clinical sequence of a healer doing an intake assessment. And then she looked at him specifically, at whatever was showing in his face in this particular gray morning light, with the performance stripped entirely away. You read the document, she said quietly. All 4 words I wrote. Yes. And you came anyway. There was never a version of tonight where I didn't come. He said it without the management layer, without the tone of a king issuing a statement of position. He said it the way he'd answered Drool's question, with the direct truth, because he was apparently done with the other kind. There was never a version. She looked at him for a moment that was long enough to contain something neither of them had found the words for yet. Then from the doorway, Korath said, with the tone of a man exercising maximum discretion about his timing. My king, we should move before his outer perimeter regroups. Draven looked at Celine. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who had been calculating the situation since before he arrived and had her own account of the exits. He took her hand, not in the way he'd placed his hand over hers at the celebration table. Brief, deniable, the careful touch of a man managing his own exposure. He took it fully, fingers interlaced, the grip of a man who had stopped managing. They walked out of the camp into the early marsh morning, through the reed grass and the thin rain and the pale gray light coming up across the water, and behind them Drool watched from the broken wall with the expression of a man who had prepared for every version of this encounter, except the one where the Alpha King he'd spent 4 years studying turned out to be more dangerous for being in love than he had ever been for being feared. And ahead of them, at the tributary crossing where the horses waited, the road back to Valethorn ran straight and clear in the growing light. But somewhere behind them, already moving on fast horses through the western approach road that Draven had not covered, because 11 men could not cover every road, and he had known this and chosen anyway. A messenger was riding hard toward the capital with a sealed letter addressed to every Alpha Lord in the Alliance. A letter that had been prepared 3 weeks ago, in the careful handwriting of a man who had planned for the possibility that Kassith Drool's operation might fail. A letter that contained the bloodline claim, the forged testimony, and the formal accusation of treason, not against Celine, against Draven himself. And it would arrive at the Moon Council chambers before they did. The letter arrived at the Moon Council chambers at the 7th hour of morning. Draven knew this because Kaelin's fastest rider met them on the road, 11 miles from the capital, with the report already written out in the tight shorthand the intelligence officer used when speed mattered more than elegance. The sealed letter, the forged testimony, the formal accusation, and the names of the 14 Alpha Lords who had received copies before the rider could be intercepted. 14 Lords. Not all of them hostile, not all of them convinced, but all of them now in possession of a document that accused the sitting king of suppressing a legitimate blood right claim, and in the specific political architecture of the Alpha Alliance, possession of the accusation was more than half the battle regardless of its truth. Draven read the report on horseback without stopping, folded it, and put it in his jacket beside the original documents. Celine, riding beside him, watched his face. "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough that the response matters more than the damage," he said. "Which means we ride straight to the council chambers. Not the palace first, not the war room, straight there." She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her doing the calculation, the same calculation he'd already done, the one that ended in the same place regardless of which direction you approached it from. The only move that worked was the one he'd told Drool about in the marsh camp. Full exposure, no management. The truth presented in the room where the lie was already sitting, before the lie had time to consolidate into accepted reality. "They'll have had 3 hours with it by the time we arrive," she said. "Yes. 3 hours is enough time for men to decide what they believe." 3 hours is enough time for men to decide what's convenient, he said. That's different. Convenient positions are negotiable. Actual belief is harder to shift, but it's also harder to fake. He looked at her, at the bruise along her cheekbone that had darkened with the hours, at the steadiness in her eyes that had not moved since the marsh camp, regardless of what the morning had put in front of it. "I need you to walk into that chamber beside me. Not behind me. Beside." She held his gaze. "I know. And I need you to speak. When it's time. Your own words, your own account, not mine. Draven." She said his name with the particular quality she had. Not soft, not hard. The quality of something precisely true. "I've been carrying this alone since I found the documents. I'm done carrying it alone." He looked at her for a moment that contained more than the road allowed time for, and then he looked forward and rode. The Moon Council chambers occupied the upper floor of the Alliance Hall in the eastern quarter of Valethorn, a building that predated the Kael dynasty by 2 centuries and had been deliberately maintained in its original form as a symbol of the Alliance's independence from any single throne. Neutral ground, technically. The kind of neutral ground that only functioned as long as the parties involved agreed to the fiction, which they did, because the alternative was acknowledging that the most powerful room in the territory was controlled by whoever had the most soldiers outside its doors on a given day. When Draven arrived with Celine and 9 men, Veth had taken Drool back to the palace under guard, Korath riding ahead to the council building. The Alliance Hall's outer courtyard held the horses and riders of 11 separate Alpha Lords, which meant 11 separate contingents of guards and advisors and political witnesses, all of them representing the specific calculation of men who had received a serious accusation before breakfast and arrived at the council chambers to determine what it meant for their position. The guards at the outer door looked at Draven with the expression of men who had been briefed that this arrival was possible and had not been told what to do about it. He walked past them without breaking stride, which answered their question. Inside the main passage, Lord Aldrath fell into step beside him, appearing from a side corridor with the timing of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment. His face had the controlled neutrality of a senior commander delivering a battlefield report that contained bad news. 14 lords received the letter, Aldrath said, low and fast. 6 are in the chamber. 2 are undecided and can be reached. The other 4 arrived with their advisors and have been talking for 2 hours, and their position is a pause. Entrenched. "Who's leading the 4? Draven said. "Warlord Fenrath the Elder. He's been waiting for a legitimate reason to challenge the Kael succession for 6 years, and this letter gives him the legal framework he needed." Aldrath glanced at Celine beside Draven, a quick professional assessment. "He'll present the forged testimony the moment you enter. He has witnesses prepared." "Let him present it," Draven said. Aldrath looked at him. "My king, let him present everything he has," Draven said. "All of it. Every forged document, every prepared witness, every legal argument. I want it all in the open air where everyone can see its shape." He didn't slow. Because the only thing worse than a lie that's been heard is a lie that's been suppressed, and every man in that chamber will know the difference between the two by the end of this morning. Aldrath said nothing further. He understood, the way men who had served in enough serious situations understood, when the king had made a decision that was past the point of counsel. The chamber doors opened. The Moon Council chamber was a large circular room with tiered seating arranged around a central floor, the design of a space built for debate rather than for hierarchy, which was either its most noble feature or its most naive one depending on the day and who was in it. Today it held 43 people, the 6 Alpha Lords in their tiered seats, their advisors ranked behind them, the council clerks at their recording tables, and the general body of witnesses that the council's open session rules required to be present during formal proceedings. The room went quiet when Draven entered. Not the polite quiet of ceremony, the specific quiet of a room that has been in active, heated discussion and has suddenly encountered the subject of that discussion walking through its doors. The kind of quiet that had a texture, 43 people simultaneously recalibrating what the next 10 minutes looked like. Draven walked to the center floor. Celine walked beside him. He did not look around the room to read the expressions. He already knew what he would find, and spending time on it was time spent not doing what needed doing. He looked at Fenrath the Elder, who sat in the senior tier to the left. A big man, gray and weathered, with the settled authority of someone who had been the most powerful person in most rooms for long enough that the posture of it had become structural. Fenrath looked back at him with eyes that held no surprise and a great deal of preparation. "Lord Fenrath," Draven said, and his voice carried in the circular room with the clean acoustics it had been designed for. "I'm told you received a letter this morning." "The council received a letter," Fenrath said. He used the institutional framing deliberately. "This is not my action, this is the Alliance's process." The linguistic move of a man who had learned to use structure as a weapon. A serious accusation, properly filed, concerning the legitimacy of the current Kale succession and the suppression of a prior blood right claim. "I know what the letter contains," Draven said. "Present it. A beat." Fenrath had prepared for resistance, for legal argument, for the defensive posture of a king trying to suppress evidence. He had not prepared for invitation. The beat was brief but visible. "The council's process requires yetasi icharan." "Present it," Draven said again. "Everything. The bloodline claim, the testimony, the historical documentation, all of it. Put it on the floor where every person in this room can examine it." He looked around the chamber for the first time, not to read expressions but to include every person in what he was about to say. "Because I'm going to present the original documents alongside it. And then this council is going to look at both sets of evidence in the same light on the same floor, and every man and woman here is going to make their determination based on what's actually in front of them." The room's quality of silence changed again. This was the silence of a room that had expected a fight and was now watching something it didn't have a prepared response to. Fenrath's lead advisor leaned toward him and said something low. Fenrath listened without looking at him, his eyes staying on Draven, the eyes of a man reassessing a position he had believed was strong. The presentation took 40 minutes. Fenrath's people were thorough. The forged testimony from 3 witnesses, the historical legal arguments about the blood right suppression, the genealogical evidence carefully constructed to show the Kale succession as illegitimate. It was well-made work. Draven watched it be presented and noted its construction with the professional attention of a man who had spent years reading the difference between what was built to deceive and what was built to last. And this was built to deceive, but it was built well. And in a room with 43 people and a 2-hour head start, it had done what good deceptions do. It had gotten into the structure of how the audience was thinking before the truth had a chance to frame the questions. When Fenrath finished, the chamber was weighted toward the accusation. Not decisively, but weighted. Draven stepped forward and placed the original documents on the council floor. He didn't speak immediately. He let the clerks examine them, let the council's chief recorder verify the seal and the age and the provenance. Let the process do what it was designed to do before he added words to it. When the recorder looked up and nodded, the specific nod of a professional confirming that what he's holding is what it claims to be, Draven began. He did not make arguments. He did not construct a defense. He told the story, the complete story, from the archive to the balcony to the marsh camp, in the plain factual sequence that it had happened, without the management layer, without the political framing, without any of the strategic presentation that 11 years of kingship had trained him to apply to every public account. He told them what was in the documents. He told them what the bloodline claim actually established. Not a challenge to the Kale succession, but a parallel legitimacy, a blood right that existed alongside his own, that had been suppressed not because it was a threat, but because someone, 3 generations ago, had been afraid of complexity. He told them that the suppression had been wrong. He said it in front of 43 people and 14 Alpha Lords, flatly, with the same tone he used for stating coordinates. His own dynasty's founding had been wrong to suppress the prior claim. Wrong. He said it. The chamber was very still. Then he looked at Celine, who was standing to his left, and he said, The woman beside me carries the blood right that was suppressed. She found the evidence in my own archive while serving my court as a healer. She brought it to me immediately. She was abducted from this palace by people who wanted that evidence destroyed before it could reach this chamber. He paused. The pause was not for effect. It was the pause of a man who had arrived at the sentence that mattered, and wanted to be certain he meant every word of it before he said it. She is not a threat to this throne, he said. She is what this throne should have stood for from the beginning. And if this council determines that her blood right requires acknowledgement under alliance law, then this council is correct, and the acknowledgement will be made, Fenrath said into the silence. You're conceding the blood right claim. I'm recognizing a truth, Draven said. That's different from conceding a political position. The legal consequence is the same. The legal consequence, Draven said, is that Selene Vera's lineage is formally acknowledged before this council. What that means for governance is a question this council determines through its process. I'm not here to resist that process. I'm here to make sure it starts with accurate information. Fenrath looked at him for a long moment. The prepared adversarial position, the one he'd constructed over weeks and arrived at this chamber to execute, was not designed for this. It was designed for a king defending territory. It had no mechanism for handling a king who laid the territory down and invited examination. That was the thing that Draven had understood, somewhere between the marsh camp and the capital road, about what the next hours required. The tools that had built his reign, the force, the intimidation, the careful management of information, the relentless positioning, were the exact tools that would destroy what he was trying to protect if he used them here. The only move that worked was the one that looked, by every metric his 11 years had trained him to use, like the most vulnerable move on the board. Vulnerability chosen deliberately was not weakness. It was the most precise weapon he had ever used, and it was the only one that could reach the actual problem, which was not Fenrath, and not the forged letter, but the thing underneath both of them. The 4 decades of accumulated fear and manipulation and suppression that had made the Alliance into a structure held together by threat rather than by anything that would survive the removal of that threat. The council deliberated for 2 hours. Draven sat against the wall of an anteroom and let his left forearm be wrapped by Selene, who had found a medical kit in the council building service room with the automatic efficiency of someone whose eyes cataloged medical supplies the way other people cataloged exits. She worked on the cut without excessive comment, cleaned it, assessed it, wrapped it with the particular practice tightness that hurt slightly and meant it was done correctly. He watched her hands. The 4 words, he said. She looked up. What you wrote in the margin. He looked at her directly. You knew when you wrote them what they would mean if I read them. She was quiet for a moment, hand still on his arm, the wrapping done, but not released. I knew what they meant legally, she said. I didn't know what they meant to you. They meant I was coming to get you regardless of what the council did with the information. She held his gaze with those dark eyes, and what was in them now was not the careful measured thing that had lived there for 2 years of navigating the particular danger of being the person a powerful man valued in a court full of people watching for exactly that. What was in them now was what had been underneath that, the actual feeling, the one she had managed as carefully as he had managed his, the one that had existed in the space between his hand on hers at the celebration table and every conversation that had been about something else while being about this. I know, she said, quietly. I knew before you arrived in that room. How? She almost smiled. The almost smile he had been cataloging for 8 months, the one that was precursor to something real. Because you came with 11 men, she said. Not an army. Not a war council directive and a formal extraction operation. 11 men and yourself at the front. Her hands released his arm. That's not how you protect a political asset. He looked at her. Outside the anteroom, 43 people were deciding something that would determine the shape of the next decade. He found, sitting against the wall with the bandage on his arm and the documents in his jacket and the broken pendant against his chest, that the weight of what was being decided felt different than it had for 11 years of decisions. Lighter. Not because it mattered less, but because he was carrying it differently. Not alone, not behind the management layer, not with the grinding, isolated labor of a man who had decided that needing anything from anyone was the primary vulnerability to be avoided. Something cracked open in that slowly, like ground after a long frost. Selene. He said her name the way he said things that were simply true. I spent 11 years building every wall I could find between myself and the possibility of this. She looked at him. Not because I didn't want it, he said. Because I understood exactly how much damage it could do to both of us if I was wrong about what I was able to be. He paused. I'm still not entirely certain I'm not wrong. I know that too, she said, without judgment, without the performance of reassurance, just the plain acknowledgement of a woman who had spent 2 years reading him clearly enough to know what was under every version of his face, and who had made her own calculation about the risk, and had arrived at her own answer. You found the document, he said. You could have come to me immediately and let me handle it. That would have been the safe choice. The safe choice would have gotten you killed, she said, and destroyed the throne, and started a civil war. She looked at him steadily. I'm a healer. I look at the full system, not just the presenting injury. That's not why you did it. A pause. The honest pause of someone deciding whether to say the actual thing when they've been saying the careful thing for a long time. No, she said. It's not only why. The council doors opened at the 10th hour. The determination was read by the chief recorder in the formal language of alliance law. Precise, structured, every word carrying specific legal weight. Draven stood on the center floor and listened to it with Celine beside him and Korath to his left, and the chamber holding the specific quality of silence that preceded something that would be written about. The blood right claim was found legitimate. Celine Vera's lineage was formally acknowledged under alliance law as a valid parallel, blood right to the Kael succession. The suppression 3 generations prior was noted in the official record as a procedural violation of founding alliance protocols. The forged testimony against Draven was examined, found fraudulent, and its origin, traced through the document construction back to Varys' network and Drool's operation, was entered into the formal record as an act of deliberate council manipulation. Kesseth Drool's border faction was placed under a formal alliance sanction pending full investigation. And in the final clause, the one that Fenrath the Elder voted for with the specific expression of a man who had come prepared for a war and was choosing, in the last moment, not to start it, the council formally recognized the legitimacy of both blood right claims and remanded to the sitting king the determination of how they were to be reconciled in governance. Both claims. Legitimate. The reconciliation his to make. He nodded immediately, before the recorder closed the session, standing on the floor of the Moon Council chamber in front of every Alpha Lord in the Alliance with the dried blood still on his jacket from the Marsh camp and the bandage on his left arm and the broken pendant in his closed fist. He declared Celine Vera his equal before the crown. Not his consort, not his ward, not a managed political accommodation of her blood right. His equal. The word that had no legal precedent in 4 generations of Kael rule, that would require every succession document in the palace archive to be rewritten, that would make every political advisor he employed wince simultaneously. The word that was the only accurate one. The chamber absorbed it in silence. Then Fenrath the Elder, who had arrived it this morning intending to dismantle the Kael throne, and was leaving it having watched the Kael king dismantle himself, and rebuild something different in the same morning, made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite approval, but was the sound of a man acknowledging, against his preferences, that what he had just witnessed was real. Months passed. The storms of that autumn gave way to the hard, clean cold of winter, and then to the slow return of spring, and the kingdom changed in the way kingdoms change when the change comes from the inside rather than being imposed, unevenly, with resistance in some quarters and surprising acceptance in others, with setbacks and negotiations and the grinding daily work of dismantling systems that had been built on fear and replacing them with something that had to earn its hold through different means. It was harder. Everything done honestly was harder than the version done through force. Draven knew it was harder. Everything done honestly was harder than the version done through force. Draven knew this and worked through it with the same focused endurance he'd brought to every campaign, except that the landscape of this one was entirely different. Not territory, but people. Not supply lines, but trust. Not enemy positions, but the accumulated skepticism of men who had been governed through fear long enough that the offer of something else felt like a trap. Some of them decided it wasn't a trap. Slowly, in the way that trust built slowly, through consistency, through the king being the same man in the difficult moments that he was in the easy ones, through Celine standing beside him in the court and the council chambers and the field visits with the steady presence of someone who was not performing a role but simply being what she was, which turned out to be exactly what the position required. Some of them never decided. That was the reality that idealized accounts of transformation left out. That some men had built their entire sense of the world around the structure that was being changed. And the change felt to them like destruction, because it was the destruction of the only framework they knew. Draven let those men leave the court when they chose to leave it, and filled their positions with people who could work inside the new thing and did not pretend it was clean. On the anniversary of the storm, he took Celine back to the east balcony. The evening was clear, genuinely clear. The sky above Valethorn, the deep blue of late autumn, stars appearing in the east above the mountains, while the last light held in the west. The celebration below was quieter than the one a year ago, smaller, the specific quality of a celebration that had earned its tone rather than declaring it. Real fires rather than performed ones. The sound of it rose to the balcony in the comfortable distance of something that belonged to itself, not to the performance of royal spectacle. Draven stood at the railing where the blood had been and looked at the stone, which showed nothing now. A year of weather had taken everything the night had left. The stone was just stone. Celine stood beside him. He had replaced the railing ironwork in the spring, not to erase what had happened, but because the original had been structurally compromised by the years and the repair needed doing regardless. The new ironwork was simpler, heavier, built to last rather than built to look significant. He opened his left hand. The silver pendant sat in his palm. Repaired now, the chain resoldered, the disc cleaned and polished back to what it had been before the night it was broken. He had given it to the palace jeweler in the third week after the council session, when enough of the immediate crisis had settled that there was time for small things. The jeweler had asked no questions, which was either discretion or understanding. "You kept it this whole time," Celine said. "I kept it the night it broke and every night since," he said. "I wasn't entirely sure what that meant for the first 3 months." She looked at the pendant in his hand, then at him. The bruise from the marsh camp was long gone. Her face in the evening light was the face he had been memorizing for 2 years without admitting that he was memorizing it. Every variation of it, the focused healer's expression and the almost smile and the direct unflinching look that had never once softened to make him more comfortable. "And now?" she said. He looked at her. At everything she had been and done and chosen. The document she'd found and carried alone, the disappearance from the balcony, the marsh camp where she'd been standing upright at a post rather than sitting on the floor, the council chamber where she'd spoken her own account in her own words, with the steady clarity of someone who had decided what she was worth and was not negotiating it downward for anyone's convenience. A man built the way he had been built, by loss and discipline and the long practice of needing nothing, came to understand certain things late that other men understood earlier, and paid a different price for the lateness, and carried the payment differently afterward. "Now I know what it means," he said. He held the pendant out to her. She took it from his palm and held it for a moment. The weight of it, the repaired chain, the disc that had been broken and was whole again in the specific way that repaired things were whole, visibly so. The mark of what had happened to them, part of what they were now. Then she reached up and placed it back in his hand, not returning it, placing it there deliberately, her fingers closing his around it. "You keep it," she said. He looked at her. "You came through the marsh in the dark with 11 men," she said. "You stood in front of 43 people and said the thing that needed saying even when it cost the most. You kept the pendant every night for a year." She looked at him with the eyes that held things, that had always held things, and what they were holding now was not the careful managed feeling of someone navigating proximity to power, but the actual thing, clear and whole and entirely undefended. "You've been keeping it already. I'm just telling you that you should." The celebration continued below them, real and unhurried. The stars came fully out above the mountains, the kind of clear sky that appeared after storms had spent themselves entirely, after the weather had done everything it came to do, and the air afterward was clean and still and capable of holding light properly. Draven looked at the pendant in his closed fist. Then he looked at Celine, at everything the last year had revealed and rebuilt and made honest, and understood that the thing he had spent 11 years building walls against had gotten through anyway, not by force, but by the slower and more thorough method of being exactly what it was, consistently, until the walls were beside the point. Some defenses fell not because they were broken, but because the person inside them stopped needing them. He put the pendant in his breast pocket, against his chest, where it had lived for a year. Then he put his arm around her, his hand at her shoulder, the full grip of a man who had stopped managing his own exposure. And she settled against him with the ease of someone who had been waiting not for permission, but for certainty. And they stood on the balcony where everything had broken open a year ago and looked out at the city they were building together. And beneath the clean stars and the fading last light, the King Alpha, who had once ruled through fear, held the thing he had found something stronger than fear for, and did not let go. Below them, the kingdom celebrated. Not for a victory, not for a campaign concluded or an enemy broken. For the harder and more lasting thing, for a year survived honestly, for trust built in the difficult ground of real consequence, for the particular freedom of people who had been governed through terror long enough that the first year of something different felt, despite everything it cost, like breathing. That was what remained after the storm. Not the absence of damage, not the restoration of what had been, but the clear knowledge of what was worth standing in the storm for, and the choice, made again each morning, to stand. And that was enough. That was in the end the only thing that had ever been enough.